The White House ledgers from 1861 to 1865 contain a peculiar anomaly that historians have puzzled over for more than a century. Among the official records of staff members, advisors, cabinet secretaries, and military commanders, one name appears with unusual frequency in the private quarters. Yet she held no official title, received no government salary, and left no formal correspondence in the presidential archives. Elizabeth KECKLEY, a former slave who became Mary Todd Lincoln's personal dressmaker and confidant, was present during some of the most pivotal and intensely private moments of Lincoln's presidency. She witnessed conversations that shaped the nation's future, held dying children in her arms, stood in rooms where decisions of war and peace were made behind closed doors, and saw the first family in states of vulnerability that no photographer ever captured. When she finally broke her silence in 1868 with a controversial memoir titled Behind the Scenes, the backlash was so severe and coordinated that most copies were systematically bought up and destroyed within weeks of publication, and she spent the rest of her life, another 40 years of deliberate, calculated silence, refusing to speak about what she'd truly seen, heard, and understood during those blood-soaked years. The question that haunted Washington society for decades, whispered in parlors and debated in private clubs, was deceptively simple. What else did she know? What secrets were so dangerous, so potentially destructive to reputations and legacies, that they died with her in 1907, locked forever in a mind that had proven it could keep the confidence of the most powerful people in America? Before we continue with the story of Elizabeth KECKLEY, the woman who dressed the most powerful family in America while carrying the weight of their darkest secrets, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because the story you're about to hear has been buried, suppressed, and deliberately erased from the historical record for over a century. And in the comments below, tell me, what state are you listening from? I want to know where the truth seekers are gathered tonight, because this story touches every corner of this nation. The needle moved with mechanical precision through the silk, each stitch invisible to the naked eye, the thread tension perfect, the spacing exact. Elizabeth KECKLEY had learned this particular technique under circumstances she preferred not to remember, in a Virginia plantation house where mistakes were corrected with violence, where a young slave girl's hands had to be perfect or suffer consequences that left scars she still carried in 1860, faint white lines across her knuckles and the backs of her hands that she'd learned to hide with careful positioning. Now, at 37 years old, she sat in a modest but respectably appointed dressmaking establishment on 12th Street in Washington, D.C., a free woman with a reputation that had reached the highest circles of the capital. A reputation built stitch by painstaking stitch over years of work that had consumed her youth and nearly broken her spirit. The shop smelled of lavender sachets and fresh cotton, a deliberate choice to mask the coal smoke that perpetually hung over the city like a dirty curtain. Outside, beyond the clean windows with their tasteful displays of fabric samples and fashion plates from Paris, Washington was transforming itself from a sleepy southern town into something it had never been before. The capital of a nation tearing itself apart at the seams. It was November 1860, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with a tension that made people speak in hushed voices and glance over their shoulders. South Carolina was threatening secession, holding emergency conventions where men in expensive suits debated whether their allegiance to slavery outweighed their loyalty to the Union. Slave states across the South were following suit, and the newspapers were full of inflammatory rhetoric that promised blood and fire. And Abraham Lincoln, a prairie lawyer from Illinois, whom most of Washington society considered a crude frontier joke with his awkward height and his country accent, had just been elected president by a nation that hadn't even put his name on the ballot in most southern states. Elizabeth had built her freedom stitch by stitch, dollar by painful dollar. She'd purchased her own liberty and that of her son George for $1,200, a sum that represented 17 years of sewing late into the night by lamplight that damaged her eyes, of accepting commissions from women who looked through her as if she were furniture or wallpaper, of enduring the particular humiliation of being trusted with their bodies while being denied their basic respect, or even acknowledgement as a human being. She'd arrived in Washington in 1860 with letters of introduction from clients in St. Louis and a skill that transcended the color of her skin, though it could never entirely overcome it. Within months, she was dressing the wives of senators, cabinet members, and military officers, women who would praise her work effusively to their friends, while never inviting her to sit in their presence or offering her refreshment during long fitting sessions. Her hands never trembled, even when sewing for women who spoke casually about the inferiority of her race while she knelt at their feet, pinning hems and marking adjustments with chalk. She'd learned in slavery what many free people never mastered, the art of being simultaneously present and invisible, of hearing everything while appearing to listen to nothing, of absorbing information without showing any sign of comprehension or judgment. It was a survival skill, honed over decades of navigating a world where showing too much intelligence or awareness could be dangerous, even fatal. The door chimes rang on a cold February afternoon in 1861, and Elizabeth looked up from her work to see a woman who seemed constructed entirely of nervous energy and expensive fabric. Mary Todd Lincoln swept into the shop with the force of a small storm, her hooped skirts taking up half the available space, her eyes darting around the room as if cataloging everything for future reference or searching for hidden threats. She was shorter than Elizabeth had expected from the newspaper descriptions, with a round face that might have been pretty if not for the tightness around her mouth and eyes, the look of someone perpetually braced for criticism or betrayal. "Mrs. Keckley?" Her voice carried the soft edges of Kentucky, but sharpened and refined by years of social climbing in Springfield, Illinois, years of trying to prove herself worthy of a husband whose political ambitions had always exceeded his financial means. "I've been told you're the finest dressmaker in Washington, Mrs. McLean recommended you most highly, and Senator Davis's wife said you were the only modiste in the city who truly understands fashion. I certainly hope that's true, because I have an impossible task for you, and I need someone who won't fail me." Elizabeth rose from her chair with practiced grace, her posture perfect, her expression carefully neutral and professional. "I'll do my best to meet your needs, Mrs. Lincoln. Please, sit down and tell me what you have in mind." "I need an entire wardrobe, not just a few gowns, everything. Dresses for every possible occasion, state dinners, receptions, informal gatherings, morning calls, afternoon teas, evening entertainments. My husband is about to become President of the United States, and I will not be embarrassed by appearing in anything less than the finest fashion." Mary Todd Lincoln moved closer, and Elizabeth caught the scent of rose water and something else. Something medicinal and slightly bitter that she would later learn was laudanum, the opium-based tincture that so many women of the era used for everything from headaches to heartbreak. "But here's the difficulty, Mrs. Keckley. I need you to make me look like I belong in the White House, like I was born to be First Lady, and I need you to do it on a budget that wouldn't dress a senator's wife for a single season. Can you do that? Can you make me look like what I need to be?" It was the beginning of a relationship that would consume the next 4 years of Elizabeth's life and haunt the 42 years that followed. What started as a straightforward business arrangement, dressmaker and client, with all the usual boundaries and expectations, evolved into something far more complex and dangerous. Not quite friendship, because the chasm of race and circumstance was too vast for that, too deeply carved by centuries of slavery and oppression. But an intimacy born of proximity and shared secrets, of long hours spent in close quarters, of vulnerability witnessed and confidences exchanged. Elizabeth would spend more time in the private quarters of the White House than most cabinet members. She would hold Mary Lincoln's hand through grief that would have destroyed a stronger woman. She would witness the president in moments of despair so profound that he seemed barely human, reduced to raw anguish by the weight of a war that was consuming the nation's sons by the tens of thousands. And she would see things that were never meant to be seen, hear conversations that were never meant to be heard, and carry knowledge that would make her a target for the rest of her life. The first time Elizabeth entered the White House as Mary Lincoln's personal modiste in March of 1861, she felt the building's strange energy. A place that was simultaneously the nation's most public symbol and its most private residence, where the line between governmental business and domestic life blurred in ways that created constant tension. The executive mansion in 1861 was not the fortress it would later become. Citizens could walk in off the street during certain hours. Office seekers and petitioners crowded the hallways from dawn until late evening, and the line between public and private space was dangerously, almost recklessly thin. The president's office was on the second floor, just steps away from the family's living quarters, and the constant traffic of politicians, military officers, and favor seekers meant that privacy was nearly impossible. Mary Lincoln's private chambers were on the second floor, a suite of rooms that she was already redecorating with a fervor that bordered on obsession, spending money that hadn't been appropriated and making decisions that would later come back to haunt her. Elizabeth would later understand that the spending, the constant acquisition of drapes, carpets, furniture, china, and clothes, was Mary's way of controlling something in a world that was spiraling beyond anyone's control, of creating beauty and order in the face of chaos and dissolution. "The newspapers call me a traitor because I was born in Kentucky," Mary said during one of their early fittings, standing in her undergarments while Elizabeth pinned a bodice, her fingers working quickly and efficiently. "They say I'm a Confederate sympathizer, that I'm passing information to the rebels, that I can't be trusted because my family owns slaves. My own brothers are fighting for the South, did you know that? 3 of them have joined the Confederate Army. One of them will die at Baton Rouge, another at Vicksburg, a third at Chickamauga. And people wonder why I can't sleep at night, why I need medicine just to get through the day." Elizabeth said nothing, her mouth full of pins, but she filed the information away in the mental catalog she was building. She was learning that Mary Lincoln needed to talk, needed someone who would listen without judgment or gossip, someone who couldn't use the information against her because her position in society was too precarious. And Elizabeth, trained by slavery to be the perfect confidant, knew instinctively how to hold secrets, how to create a space where powerful people felt safe unburdening themselves. The war came to Washington like a fever in the summer of 1861. The city transformed into an armed camp almost overnight. Soldiers filled the streets, their uniforms still new and clean, their faces still young and optimistic. Hospitals sprang up in churches and public buildings, preparing for casualties that everyone hoped wouldn't come, but feared were inevitable. The Potomac River became a highway for military transport, and the sound of drums and marching feet became the city's constant soundtrack. The White House itself was fortified, with guards posted at every entrance and sharpshooters positioned on the roof, scanning the surrounding buildings for threats. Elizabeth witnessed the president's transformation during those early months of the war. Abraham Lincoln had arrived in Washington as a gangly, awkward figure who told jokes at inappropriate moments and seemed uncomfortable in formal clothes, who walked with a shambling gait and spoke with a frontier accent that made sophisticated Easterners wince. But the weight of the war carved him into something else. A man who aged a decade in a single year, whose eyes took on a haunted quality that never entirely left them, whose face became a map of suffering that deepened with every casualty report. She was present one evening in August 1861, making adjustments to one of Mary's gowns in the First Lady's private sitting room, when the president entered without knocking, his face gray with exhaustion and something darker. He didn't seem to notice Elizabeth standing in the corner, her hands full of silk and thread, as invisible as she'd learned to make herself. "They're calling it a disaster," he said, his voice hollow and defeated. "Bull Run. We thought it would be a quick victory, a show of force to bring the rebels to their senses, to make them understand that the Union couldn't be dissolved by a vote. Instead, our boys ran. They broke and ran like rabbits, Mary. Congressmen and their wives had gone out to watch the battle like it was a sporting event, with picnic baskets and opera glasses. They had to flee for their lives when our army collapsed. And now McDowell is asking for more troops, more time, more everything, and I don't know if this nation has more to give. I don't know if I have more to give. Mary went to him immediately, and Elizabeth watched as the First Lady guided her husband to a chair with surprising gentleness, her hands gentle on his shoulders, her voice soft and soothing. You'll find a way. You always do, Abraham. You've never failed at anything you truly set your mind to. Will I? Lincoln looked up and Elizabeth saw something in his face that terrified her. Doubt so profound it seemed to hollow him out from the inside, leaving just a shell of the confident leader the public saw. I'm sending men to die, Mary. Boys, really. 18, 19 years old, farm boys who've never been more than 20 miles from home. And for what? To force states to remain in a union they've voted to leave? Sometimes I wake up at night and wonder if I'm the tyrant they say I am. If history will remember me as the man who destroyed the Republic in order to save it. Elizabeth's hands stilled on the fabric. She was hearing something no one was meant to hear. The private despair of a man who had to project absolute confidence to a nation watching his every move, analyzing his every decision. You're preserving the nation, Mary said firmly, with a conviction that surprised Elizabeth. And ending slavery. Don't forget that part, Abraham. Whatever else this war is about, whatever political calculations you have to make, it's about that too. It has to be. Lincoln was silent for a long moment, his large hands hanging between his knees, his shoulders slumped. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I can't make it about slavery, not yet, not publicly. The border states would revolt. Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, Delaware. We'd lose them all, and then we'd lose the war. I have to wait for the right moment, the right victory, before I can make that proclamation. And in the meantime, men like Frederick Douglass call me a coward and a compromiser, and maybe they're right. Maybe I am choosing political expediency over moral imperative. Elizabeth felt something shift in her chest, a complicated mix of emotions that she couldn't entirely name. She'd known, of course, that the war was connected to slavery. How could it not be? The South had seceded specifically to protect the institution that had held her in bondage for the first 33 years of her life. But hearing the president speak about it in such calculating terms, as a political tool to be deployed at the right moment rather than a moral imperative to be acted upon immediately, filled her with a complicated mix of hope, bitterness, and a kind of weary understanding. This was how power worked, not through grand moral gestures, but through careful calculation and compromise. She'd never told Mary Lincoln the full story of her enslavement, and she never would. How she'd been born in Dinwiddie County, Virginia, to a slave mother named Agnes, and a white father named Armistead Burwell, who never acknowledged her existence. How she'd been loaned to her master's son when she was 14 years old and subjected to 4 years of systematic abuse that resulted in the birth of her son, George. How she'd been beaten by a schoolmaster hired specifically to break her spirit because her master thought she was too proud, too intelligent, too aware of her own worth. How she'd sewn her way to freedom with fingers that sometimes bled onto the fabric, leaving stains she had to carefully hide or explain away. How she'd spent 17 years accumulating the money to purchase her own body and her son's. 17 years of being property working to stop being property. The Lincolns knew she'd been a slave, of course. It was part of her story, part of what made her acceptable in certain circles, the noble slave who had lifted herself up through hard work and talent. But they didn't know the texture of it, the daily humiliations and terrors that had shaped her into someone who could stand silently in a corner and hear the president's despair without flinching, without offering unwanted comfort or judgment. The autumn of 1861 brought a different kind of tension to Washington. The war had settled into what people were beginning to realize would be a long, grinding conflict rather than the quick resolution everyone had hoped for. The casualty lists grew longer with each engagement. The hospitals filled with wounded men, and the sound of ambulance wagons became a constant presence in the streets. And Mary Lincoln's spending accelerated, as if she could somehow ward off the darkness by surrounding herself with beautiful things. Elizabeth was fitting Mary for a new gown one October afternoon when the First Lady suddenly grabbed her wrist with surprising strength, her fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks. "I need to tell you something," Mary said, her eyes feverish and slightly unfocused. "Something I can't tell anyone else. Something that would ruin me if it became public. Will you keep my confidence, Elizabeth? Will you swear it?" "Of course, Mrs. Lincoln," Elizabeth said carefully, though a part of her wanted to refuse, wanted to avoid whatever burden was about to be placed on her shoulders. "I'm in debt. Terrible debt. I've spent more than $27,000 on redecorating the White House, and Congress only appropriated $20,000. I've been hiding the bills, putting off the merchants, making promises I can't keep. If Abraham finds out, if the newspapers find out, they'll destroy me. They'll say I'm frivolous and wasteful while soldiers are dying. And they'll be right, Elizabeth. They'll be right, and I can't stop myself. I can't stop buying things, can't stop trying to make this place beautiful, because if I stop, if I sit still for even a moment, I'll have to think about my brothers fighting against my husband, about the fact that half the country thinks I'm a traitor, about the possibility that we might lose this war and everything will have been for nothing." Elizabeth felt a wave of anger that she carefully suppressed, keeping her face neutral and sympathetic. Mary Lincoln had spent in a single year more than Elizabeth had earned in her entire life, had spent it on luxuries she didn't need, while Elizabeth had sewn for 17 years to buy her own body. But she also felt pity, because she could see that Mary was trapped in her own kind of slavery to her insecurities, her need for validation, her terror of being judged and found wanting. "I'll help you however I can, Mrs. Lincoln," Elizabeth said, though she had no idea what that help would entail or what price she would eventually pay for offering it. The winter of 1862 brought a horror that dwarfed all the political and financial concerns. Willie Lincoln, the president's 11-year-old son, fell ill in early February. At first, it seemed like a common cold, the kind of childhood ailment that passed quickly with rest and care. But as the days wore on, the boy's fever climbed higher and higher, and the doctors began using words like bilious fever, what would later be understood as typhoid, likely contracted from the contaminated water supply that served the White House, drawn from the Potomac River downstream from sewage outlets. Elizabeth was there the night Willie died, February 20th, 1862. She'd been summoned to Mary's chambers to help with some urgent alteration. Mary had insisted that she needed a new dress for a reception, though everyone knew the reception would be cancelled if Willie's condition worsened. When Elizabeth arrived, she found the First Lady in a state of barely controlled hysteria, surrounded by doctors and staff who seemed helpless in the face of her grief. The sound Mary Lincoln made when her son died was something Elizabeth would hear in her nightmares for the rest of her life. It wasn't a scream, exactly. It was something more primal, more ancient, a keening wail that seemed to come from somewhere beyond human language, beyond civilization itself. It was the sound of a mother's heart breaking, and it filled the White House like a physical presence. The president had to physically carry his wife from the room, and Elizabeth watched as this tall, ungainly man cradled his wife like a child, his own face a mask of anguish so profound it seemed to age him another decade in a single moment. She heard him say, his voice breaking, "You must control yourself, Mary. You must, or you'll go mad. Think of Tad. Think of Robert. They need you." But Mary Lincoln did go mad in a way. Not the dramatic, institutionalizable madness that would come later, after the assassination, but a quieter unraveling that manifested in seances and spending sprees, in paranoid accusations against staff members she was convinced were stealing from her or plotting against her, in an inability to enter the room where Willie had died. Elizabeth became her anchor during those dark months, The one person Mary seemed to trust completely. The one person who could calm her when the grief threatened to overwhelm her entirely. It was during this period that Elizabeth began to understand the true nature of her position. She wasn't just a dressmaker. She was a confidant, a witness, a keeper of secrets, and, though she didn't fully realize it yet, a repository for information that powerful people needed to unburden but couldn't risk sharing with anyone who might use it for political gain or personal advantage. One afternoon in May 1862, while Elizabeth was fitting Mary for yet another black mourning dress, the First Lady would wear nothing but black for over a year, Mary suddenly grabbed her hand with desperate strength. "I've been attending séances," Mary said, her voice low and urgent. "There's a medium, Mrs. Lorry, who comes to the White House. She's helped me contact Willie." "I've spoken to him, Elizabeth. I've heard his voice. He's at peace, he says. He's happy. He wants me to stop grieving so much." Elizabeth kept her expression neutral, though her heart sank. She'd heard about these séances, whispered about by White House staff who found them disturbing and inappropriate. The idea of the First Lady of the United States consulting with spiritualists during a time of national crisis was political dynamite, the kind of scandal that could undermine the president's authority and give ammunition to his enemies. "Does the president know?" Elizabeth asked carefully. "He's attended some of them. He doesn't believe, not really, but he indulges me because he thinks it brings me comfort." He sits there with that patient, sad expression on his face while Mrs. Lorry channels Willie's spirit. Mary's grip tightened painfully. "But there's more, Elizabeth. Mrs. Lorry has told me things, warnings about people close to us who mean us harm. She says there are conspirators in the White House itself, people who want to see Abraham dead, who are working with the Confederates to bring down the government. She's given me names, Elizabeth. Names of people I thought were loyal." Elizabeth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "Mrs. Lincoln, perhaps these séances aren't— You think I'm mad." Mary released her hand abruptly, her expression hardening. "Everyone thinks I'm mad, but I know what I know. There are people who want to destroy us, Elizabeth. And when this war is over, when Abraham has saved the Union, they'll come for us. They'll try to ruin us, to expose every mistake, every secret, every moment of weakness. And there are so many secrets, Elizabeth. So many things that can never come to light." The comment hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and threat. Elizabeth wanted to ask what secrets Mary meant, but something in the First Lady's expression stopped her. Some doors, once opened, couldn't be closed. Some knowledge was too dangerous to possess. The Emancipation Proclamation came in September 1862, preliminary and frustratingly limited, applying only to states in rebellion and leaving slavery intact in the border states that had remained loyal to the Union. Elizabeth read it in the newspaper with tears streaming down her face, sitting alone in her shop on 12th Street after all her assistants had gone home. It wasn't everything. It didn't free the slaves in Kentucky or Maryland or Missouri, didn't address the fundamental question of whether black people would ever be truly equal in America, didn't undo the centuries of oppression and violence. But it was something. It was a beginning, a crack in the wall that had seemed impenetrable. She was at the White House the next day and found the president in an unusually reflective mood. He'd come to Mary's chambers to see how a particular dress was progressing. He took an interest in his wife's appearance that surprised many people, often commenting on her gowns and offering opinions on colors and styles. And he stood by the window, looking out at the city with an expression Elizabeth couldn't quite read. "Mrs. Keckley," he said, turning to her suddenly. "You were born a slave, weren't you?" "Yes, Mr. President." "And you purchased your freedom? You and your son?" "Yes, sir. $1,200. It took me 17 years to earn it, working every day and most nights." Lincoln was quiet for a moment, his long fingers drumming on the windowsill. "I've just signed a document that will free millions of people like you. Or at least, that's what I hope it will do. But I wonder sometimes if a piece of paper can really change what's in men's hearts. Can it, do you think? Can a proclamation undo centuries of hatred and fear Elizabeth chose her words carefully, aware that she was treading on dangerous ground. "A piece of paper gave me my freedom, Mr. President, but it didn't make me free. That's something I had to do for myself every day, by refusing to let slavery define who I was, by building a life and a business and a reputation that had nothing to do with what I had been, and everything to do with what I chose to become. Your proclamation will give people the chance to do the same. Whether they take that chance, whether this nation lets them take it, that's the question that will define the next 100 years." Lincoln looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between respect and sadness. "You're a wise woman, Mrs. Keckley, wiser than most of the men who advise me. I hope my wife knows how fortunate she is to have you." But Elizabeth didn't feel wise. She felt like someone standing at the edge of a precipice, watching forces beyond her control reshape the world, knowing that the changes coming would be both wonderful and terrible, that freedom would bring new challenges and new forms of oppression that no one could fully anticipate. The war ground on through 1863 and into 1864, and Elizabeth watched as the casualty lists grew longer, as the president's face grew more haggard and lined, as Mary Lincoln's spending and paranoia spiraled further out of control. She learned that Mary had run up enormous debts, tens of thousands of dollars in clothing and furnishings that she'd hidden from her husband, bills that she'd put off, and promises she'd made to merchants in New York and Philadelphia, who were growing increasingly impatient. "You have to help me," Mary said one evening in early 1864, gripping Elizabeth's hands with desperate strength, her eyes wild and unfocused. "I owe money to every merchant in New York and Philadelphia. $50,000, maybe more. I've lost track. If Abraham isn't re-elected, if we have to leave the White House, they'll come after me. They'll sue me, Elizabeth. The newspapers will destroy me. They'll say I bankrupted the nation while soldiers were dying. You have to help me figure out how to pay them. You're clever with money. You bought your freedom. Help me buy mine." Elizabeth felt a wave of anger that she carefully suppressed, keeping her face neutral and sympathetic. Mary Lincoln had spent in 4 years more than most people would earn in a lifetime, had spent it on luxuries she didn't need, while Elizabeth had sewn for 17 years to buy her own body and her son's. But she also felt pity, because she could see that Mary was trapped in a cycle she couldn't break, driven by forces she didn't understand and couldn't control. "I'll do what I can, Mrs. Lincoln," Elizabeth said, though she had no idea what that would be. No idea that this promise would eventually drag her into a scandal that would destroy her reputation and her business. The solution Mary eventually conceived was both desperate and revealing of her character. She began selling access to the president, arranging for office seekers and favor hunters to meet with Lincoln in exchange for money that she pocketed to pay down her debts. She sold presidential pardons, or at least facilitated meetings where pardons were discussed and money changed hands. She accepted gifts from contractors who wanted government business, from men who needed permits or licenses or exemptions from military service. Elizabeth knew about all of it. She was there when the arrangements were made, standing quietly in corners while Mary negotiated with men who spoke in careful euphemisms about donations and considerations. She was there when the money changed hands, when Mary would emerge from these transactions with a feverish triumph in her eyes and a purse heavier than when she'd entered. And Elizabeth said nothing because what could she say? Who would believe a black dressmaker over the First Lady of the United States? And even if they did believe her, what would happen to her if she spoke? She would be destroyed, her business ruined, her reputation shredded, possibly even prosecuted as an accomplice. She was trapped in a web of complicity, a witness to corruption that she was powerless to expose without destroying herself in the process. But there were other secrets too, darker ones that Elizabeth only partially understood. There were meetings late at night with men whose names she didn't know, conversations conducted in whispers that stopped abruptly when she entered a room. There were letters that Mary burned immediately after reading, holding them over a candle flame, until they were nothing but ash. There were coded messages in newspapers that Mary would read with intense concentration, her lips moving silently. One night in March 1864, Elizabeth was working late in Mary's chambers, finishing a gown that was needed for a reception the next day, when she overheard a conversation that chilled her blood. Mary was meeting with a man Elizabeth had seen before but whose name she'd never learned. A well-dressed gentleman with a southern accent who seemed to have unusual access to the First Lady's private rooms. "The situation is becoming untenable," the man was saying, his voice low and urgent. "Your brother's deaths have bought you some credibility, but there are still people who suspect. If certain letters were to surface, if certain financial transactions were to be examined too closely, the consequences would be severe. I've destroyed everything that could be traced back to me," Mary said, her voice tight with tension. "And the people who know the full extent of it are either dead or too compromised themselves to speak. What about your dressmaker? The colored woman? She's here constantly. She must see and hear things." There was a pause, and Elizabeth's heart hammered in her chest as she stood frozen behind a screen, her needle suspended in mid-air. "Elizabeth is loyal," Mary said finally. "And she's smart enough to know that her position depends on her discretion. She won't speak. For her sake, I hope you're right. These are dangerous times, Mrs. Lincoln. Dangerous for all of us." Elizabeth never learned what that conversation was really about, what letters Mary had destroyed, or what financial transactions the man was referring to. But she understood that she was in possession of dangerous knowledge, that her proximity to power had made her a potential threat to people who would not hesitate to eliminate threats. The president's re-election in November 1864 brought a temporary reprieve from the financial pressures. Mary's debts could be managed, stretched out, hidden for another 4 years. The war was winding down. Sherman had taken Atlanta and was marching to the sea, burning everything in his path. Grant was grinding Lee's army into dust in Virginia, trading casualties at a rate that horrified the nation, but was slowly, inexorably winning the war. There was a sense that the end was finally in sight, that the terrible bleeding might finally stop. Elizabeth was at the White House on the afternoon of April 14, 1865, Good Friday. She'd come to deliver a dress and found the atmosphere strangely light, almost giddy. The war was over. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox just 5 days earlier, and the other Confederate armies were collapsing one by one. The President and Mrs. Lincoln were planning to attend the theater that evening, a comedy called Our American Cousin, at Ford's Theater, just a few blocks from the White House. "Come help me dress," Mary said, pulling Elizabeth into her chambers with unusual energy. "I want to look beautiful tonight. Abraham has been so burdened for so long, so worn down by the weight of this terrible war. I want him to see me as I was when we first met, young and pretty and full of hope. I want him to remember why he married me before all of this, before the war and the death and the madness." Elizabeth helped her into a black and white striped silk dress, one of the finest she'd ever made, with intricate pleating and delicate lace trim. Mary stood before the mirror, turning this way and that, and for a moment she looked almost happy, almost like the young woman she must have been before ambition and tragedy had carved lines into her face. "Do you think he'll win them over?" Mary asked suddenly, her eyes meeting Elizabeth's in the mirror. "The Southerners, I mean. He wants to be generous in victory, to heal the nation rather than punish the rebels. With malice toward none, with charity for all," he said in his inaugural address. "But there are so many in his own party who want vengeance, who want to see the South ground into dust. They'll fight him, Elizabeth. Even now, even after all he's done, after all he's sacrificed, they'll fight him." "The president has won every fight so far," Elizabeth said, adjusting a fold of fabric at Mary's waist. "Has he?" Mary's expression darkened, the momentary happiness evaporating. "Or has he just been lucky? Mrs. Laurie warned me, you know, in our last séance, just 2 days ago. She said there was danger around him, a darkness that she couldn't quite see clearly. She said I should keep him close, keep him safe. I begged him not to go tonight, but he insists. He says the people need to see him, need to know that life can return to normal, that we can have simple pleasures again. Elizabeth felt a prickle of unease, but she dismissed it as she'd learned to dismiss most of Mary's fears and premonitions. Mary was always seeing omens and portents, always convinced that disaster lurked around every corner. It was exhausting to take her fears seriously, to treat every anxiety as a genuine threat. "You both deserve an evening of enjoyment," Elizabeth said firmly, pinning a brooch at Mary's collar. "Go to the theater, laugh. Let the nation see that their president is human, that he can enjoy a simple comedy after years of tragedy." She would replay that conversation in her mind for the rest of her life, wondering if she could have said something different, done something to prevent what came next. Though rationally, she knew there was nothing she could have done. The news reached her in the early hours of April 15th, just after midnight, a pounding on her door, her neighbor's voice shaking with shock and disbelief. "Mrs. Keckley! Mrs. Keckley! Wake up! The president's been shot! They say he's dying! Someone shot him at the theater!" Elizabeth ran through the dark streets to the White House, her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath coming in gasps. The building was in chaos, soldiers everywhere, officials rushing in and out, and a sound that cut through everything else like a knife. Mary Lincoln's screams, high and terrible, coming from somewhere inside. They wouldn't let Elizabeth into the boarding house across from the theater where Lincoln had been carried, where he lay dying in a bed too small for his long frame. She stood in the street with a crowd of other people, watching the windows, waiting for news that everyone knew was coming, but no one wanted to hear. When the president finally died at 7:22 that morning, the wail that rose from Mary Lincoln was the same sound Elizabeth had heard when Willie died, that primal, inhuman keening that signaled something broken beyond repair. The days that followed were a blur of black crepe and funeral preparations, of a nation in shock trying to process the murder of a president who had just won the war, who had seemed on the verge of healing the nation's wounds. Elizabeth dressed Mary in mourning clothes and watched as the First Lady descended into a grief so profound that she couldn't attend her husband's funeral, couldn't leave her room, couldn't function in any normal way. Mary remained in her room for 5 weeks after the assassination, refusing to leave, while the new president, Andrew Johnson, waited with barely concealed impatience for her to vacate the White House. Elizabeth was one of the few people allowed to see her during this time, and what she witnessed was a complete breakdown. A woman who had been holding herself together through sheer force of will, finally coming apart at the seams. "They're saying I was involved," Mary whispered one afternoon, gripping Elizabeth's hand with skeletal fingers. "The newspapers are suggesting that I knew about the plot, that I was in communication with the conspirators. They're saying my Southern sympathies, my brothers fighting for the Confederacy, that it all adds up to treason. They're going to destroy me, Elizabeth. They're going to take everything I have and leave me with nothing." "No one believes that, Mrs. Lincoln," Elizabeth said, though she wasn't sure it was true. The newspapers were full of wild speculation and conspiracy theories, and Mary's name appeared in many of them. "Don't they? I'm not so sure. There are things I did, Elizabeth, things I'm not proud of. The debts, the spending, the arrangements I made. If they investigate too closely, if they start asking the wrong questions, they'll find things that will confirm their worst suspicions." It was during this period, in the depths of Mary's grief and paranoia, that she made a request that would change Elizabeth's life forever. "I need you to help me sell my clothes," Mary said one afternoon, her voice flat and lifeless, all emotion drained away. "All of them. The dresses, the jewelry, the shawls, everything. I'm destitute, Elizabeth. Abraham left me almost nothing, just a small pension that won't even cover my debts. I have to raise money somehow, and my clothes are all I have. You have to help me. You're the only one I can trust." Elizabeth stared at her in disbelief and growing horror. "Mrs. Lincoln, you can't sell your clothes. The newspapers would." "I don't care about the newspapers." Mary's voice rose to a shriek, the first real emotion Elizabeth had seen from her in days. "I don't care about anything except survival. Don't you understand? I'm going to be destroyed either way. At least if I sell my clothes, I might be able to pay my debts, might be able to avoid complete ruin. Will you help me or not?" Against her better judgment, against every instinct that told her this was a terrible idea, Elizabeth agreed. Over the next 2 years, from 1867 to 1868, she would travel to New York multiple times, attempting to sell Mary Lincoln's wardrobe to brokers and collectors. It was a humiliating, degrading process that exposed both women to public ridicule and scorn. The newspapers had a field day. The widow of the martyred president, reduced to peddling her used clothes like a common pauper, like a woman of the street selling her possessions to survive. But worse than the humiliation was what Elizabeth learned during this process. As she sorted through Mary's possessions, cataloguing dresses and jewelry and shawls, she found evidence of the financial improprieties she'd witnessed. Receipts tucked into pockets, letters folded into bodices, documents that revealed the full extent of Mary's corruption during the White House years. And she realized, with a sick feeling in her stomach, that Mary had involved her in the clothes-selling scheme not just for help, but to ensure her silence. If Elizabeth ever spoke about what she'd seen, Mary could claim that Elizabeth had been complicit, that she'd profited from the corruption, that she was just as guilty. It was a trap, and Elizabeth had walked into it willingly, blinded by loyalty and pity and a misguided sense of obligation. By 1868, Elizabeth had had enough. The clothes-selling scheme had failed spectacularly. They'd raised only a fraction of what Mary needed, and the publicity had been disastrous. Mary Lincoln had turned on her, accusing her of theft and betrayal, of mishandling the sales and keeping money that rightfully belonged to her. The woman Elizabeth had served faithfully for 7 years now refused to speak to her, spread vicious rumors about her, and threatened legal action. In response, Elizabeth did something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She wrote a book. Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House, was published in April 1868. Elizabeth's goal was to defend herself against Mary's accusations and to tell her own story, the story of a woman who had risen from slavery to become confidant to the most powerful family in America, who had witnessed history being made from a unique vantage point. She included details of her time in the White House, conversations she'd overheard, private moments she'd witnessed, descriptions of Mary's character and behavior. The backlash was immediate, coordinated, and devastating. The white press called her ungrateful, treacherous, a betrayer of confidences who had violated the sacred trust between servant and employer. They said she was proof that black people couldn't be trusted with access to white society, that giving former slaves too much freedom and opportunity would inevitably lead to this kind of betrayal. The black press was divided. Some praised her courage in telling her story, but others felt she'd violated an unspoken code, that she'd confirmed white America's worst fears about giving black people access to power and privilege, that she'd made it harder for other black people to gain similar positions of trust. Mary Lincoln never spoke to her again. Most of Elizabeth's wealthy white clients abandoned her, unwilling to risk having their private lives exposed in a future memoir. The book was a commercial failure. Most copies were bought up and destroyed by Mary's allies and the Lincoln family, who wanted to suppress the revelations it contained and protect the martyred president's legacy. But the worst part, the part that would haunt Elizabeth for the remaining 40 years of her life, was what she had left out of the book. The real secrets, the financial corruption, the selling of pardons and access, the seances and paranoia, the president's moments of despair and doubt, the mysterious late-night meetings and coded messages, the suggestions of connections to Confederate sympathizers, she'd kept those to herself. The book was controversial enough with the relatively innocuous details she'd included. If she'd revealed everything she knew, everything she'd seen and heard and understood, it would have destroyed Mary Lincoln completely and likely tarnished Abraham Lincoln's legacy in ways that might never be repaired. So she made a choice. She would keep the real secrets, the dangerous ones, the ones that could reshape the historical understanding of the Lincoln presidency, locked inside her for the rest of her life. The years after the book's publication were hard in ways that Elizabeth had never experienced, even during slavery. At least in slavery, she'd known where she stood, had understood the rules and boundaries. Now she was in a kind of limbo, free but not free, with a reputation in tatters and a business that had collapsed. Her dressmaking shop closed within a year. She lived on the edge of poverty, taking in sewing work when she could find it, doing alterations and repairs for women who would never invite her into their homes, relying on the charity of friends and former clients who remained loyal despite the scandal. Her son George had died during the war, killed in August 1861 at the Battle of Wilson's Creek in Missouri while fighting for the Union. A cruel irony that she'd lost her only child, the son she'd worked 17 years to free, to the conflict that was supposed to bring freedom to people like them. She was alone in the world, with no family, few friends, and a burden of secrets that grew heavier with each passing year. She never wrote another book, never gave interviews about her time in the White House, never spoke publicly about the Lincolns again. When people asked her about those years, she would smile politely and change the subject, deflecting questions with practiced ease. The secret she carried became heavier with each passing year, a burden that shaped her into someone increasingly isolated and alone, someone who had learned that knowing too much was its own kind of curse. In 1892, 24 years after the book's publication, a journalist tracked Elizabeth down to the small room where she was living in Washington, barely scraping by on sewing work and the occasional small donation from former clients who remembered her. He wanted to interview her about the Lincoln assassination, about the conspiracy theories that had proliferated in the decades since that terrible night, about the persistent rumors that Mary Lincoln had been involved in some way. "There are people who say Mary Lincoln was involved," the journalist said, his pencil poised over his notebook, his eyes bright with the prospect of a sensational story. "That she knew about the plot, maybe even facilitated it. That her debts made her vulnerable to pressure from Confederate sympathizers, that she was passing information to the South throughout the war. You were there, Mrs. KECKLEY. You knew her better than almost anyone. You saw her in private moments that no one else witnessed. What do you think? Was Mary Lincoln a traitor?" Elizabeth looked at this young man, so eager for a sensational story, so convinced that he could uncover the truth that had eluded everyone else, and felt a wave of exhaustion so profound it was almost physical. She could tell him what she knew about Mary's debts and her desperate need for money, about the strange men who had visited the White House in those final weeks, about conversations that had seemed innocent at the time, but took on sinister meaning in retrospect. She could tell him about the séance where Mrs. Laurie had warned of danger, about Mary's insistence that there were conspirators close to the president, about how Mary had seemed almost unsurprised when the news of the assassination came, as if she'd been expecting it. She could tell him about the letters Mary had burned, about the coded messages in newspapers, about the Southern gentleman who had warned Mary about certain letters and certain financial transactions that could never come to light. She could tell him about the night she'd overheard Mary arguing with someone about the plan and the timing and making sure there were no traces. But what good would it do? Mary Lincoln was dead now, had died in 1882, mad and alone in her sister's house in Springfield, her mind finally broken by grief and guilt and whatever secrets she'd carried to her grave. Abraham Lincoln was a martyr, a secular saint whose legacy was still being fought over by politicians and historians, whose memory had become a symbol of national unity and moral righteousness. The nation had survived the war and was trying to heal, however imperfectly, however incompletely. What purpose would be served by raking up old scandals, by suggesting that the martyred president's wife might have been complicit in his murder, by tarnishing the memory of a man who had freed the slaves and saved the Union? "I think," Elizabeth said carefully, choosing each word with the precision she'd once used to place stitches, "that Mrs. Lincoln loved her husband in her own complicated way, and I think grief and guilt can look very similar from the outside, that people who are grieving often act in ways that seem suspicious or strange to those who don't understand the depths of their pain. That's all I have to say on the matter." The journalist left disappointed, and Elizabeth returned to her sewing, her hands moving with the same mechanical precision they'd had for more than 60 years. She'd made her choice long ago, to be a keeper of secrets rather than a teller of truths, to protect the dead even when they hadn't protected her in life. It was a choice that had cost her dearly, but it was the only choice she could live with, the only choice that allowed her to sleep at night. Elizabeth KECKLEY died on May 26, 1907, at the age of 89, in the Home for Destitute Women and Children in Washington, D.C., a charity institution that provided shelter for the poor and elderly, a place where the woman who had once dressed the First Lady of the United States ended her days in poverty and obscurity. She'd outlived everyone from those White House years, the Lincolns, the cabinet members, the generals and politicians who had shaped the war and its aftermath. She'd lived long enough to see the promise of Reconstruction betrayed, to watch as Jim Crow laws reimposed a different kind of slavery on her people, to witness the slow erasure of the hopes that had briefly flourished in the wake of emancipation. In her final years, she'd sometimes talk about the Lincolns to the other residents of the home, but always in vague, nostalgic terms. Mrs. Lincoln had such refined taste, or the president was a kind man, kinder than people knew. She never revealed the secrets she'd kept for 50 years, never unburdened herself of the knowledge that had made her both privileged and cursed, both insider and outsider, both witness and accomplice. When she died, she left behind almost nothing, a few pieces of furniture, some sewing supplies, and a small trunk of papers that she'd requested be burned without being read. The staff at the home honored her request, and whatever final secrets those papers contained, letters, diary entries, documents that might have answered the questions that had haunted historians for decades, went up in smoke, lost forever. But the questions remained, passed down through generations of historians and Lincoln scholars, debated in academic journals and popular books. What had Elizabeth KECKLEY really seen during those 4 years in the White House? What had she known about Mary Lincoln's financial dealings, about the corruption and influence peddling that had gone on behind the scenes? Had she witnessed conversations that would have changed the historical understanding of Lincoln's presidency? Had she known something about the assassination that she'd taken to her grave? Was Mary Lincoln involved in the plot? Or was she just a troubled woman whose behavior had been misinterpreted by people looking for conspiracies? The truth is that we'll never know. Elizabeth KECKLEY made a choice to protect the people she'd served, even when they'd betrayed her, even when speaking out might have vindicated her or brought her financial security or historical recognition. She chose silence over revelation, loyalty over truth, protection over justice, and that choice defined the last 40 years of her life, shaped her into someone who carried the weight of history on shoulders that had already carried the weight of slavery. There's a photograph of Elizabeth from her later years, taken sometime in the 1890s. She sits very straight in a high-backed chair, her hands folded in her lap, her expression serene but distant, her eyes looking directly at the camera but seeming to see something beyond the photographer, beyond the moment. Perhaps looking back at those years in the White House, at the secrets she carried, at the choices she'd made and the prices she'd paid. Those eyes had seen a president in his moments of deepest despair, had watched him struggle with decisions that would determine the fate of millions. They'd watched a first lady descend into madness and corruption, had witnessed the private face of power stripped of its public dignity and revealed in all its human frailty and weakness. They'd seen things that were never meant to be seen, heard conversations that were never meant to be heard, understood connections and implications that were never meant to be understood. And they'd kept those secrets locked away, even when revealing them might have changed history, might have altered our understanding of the Civil War and the Lincoln presidency and the assassination that had shocked the nation. In the end, Elizabeth KECKLEY's greatest act of courage wasn't purchasing her freedom or building a successful business in a society that wanted to keep her enslaved, or even writing her controversial memoir. It was her silence. The deliberate, conscious choice to carry certain truths to her grave, to protect people who hadn't protected her, to preserve a version of history that was incomplete, but perhaps more bearable than the full truth would have been. She was a woman who knew too much and said too little, who stood at the center of American history and chose to remain in the shadows, who held the power to reshape historical narratives and chose not to use it. And the secrets she kept for 50 years died with her, leaving us to wonder what truths were lost when that small trunk of papers burned, what revelations might have changed our understanding of the Civil War, the Lincoln presidency, the assassination, and the woman who dressed the First Lady while the nation tore itself apart and tried to stitch itself back together. What do you think of Elizabeth Keckley's story? Do you believe she made the right choice in keeping those secrets, or should she have revealed everything she knew, regardless of the consequences? Was her silence an act of loyalty or a betrayal of historical truth? And what do you think was really in that trunk of papers that she had burned? Just personal letters or evidence of something darker, something that would have changed everything we think we know about the Lincoln presidency? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear what you think, what theories you have about what she really knew. And if this story gave you chills, if it made you think about the price of proximity to power and the weight of secrets that can never be told, then hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves dark historical mysteries, and subscribe to Liturgy of Fear for more stories like this. Because history isn't always what we're taught in school. Sometimes the most important truths are the ones that were deliberately buried, the ones that died with the people who knew them. Until next time, keep questioning what you think you know, and remember that the people who stand in the shadows often see more than those who stand in the light.